Welcome back to the deep dive. It's always exciting to tackle a topic suggested directly by our listeners, and today's deep dive is no exception. We're going to be exploring social institutions, and we're going to be doing it from a philosopher's perspective. That's thanks to you out there who requested we approach this topic through that lens. And to help us navigate these somewhat complex philosophical waters, we're turning to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which, as always, is a treasure trove of in-depth analysis.
Exactly. So our mission today is to really unpack what these social institutions are. We'll be looking at how philosophers define them, where the agreements and disagreements lie, and of course we'll explore some of the major theoretical frameworks that philosophers have developed to understand them. And because this deep dive is specifically for you with your philosophical interests, we'll pay extra attention to the core definitional debates, those underlying ontological and normative questions, and the different theoretical approaches. We'll be sure to highlight where prominent thinkers in the field agree and where they, well, diverge.
Sounds like a plan. Now, the entry itself points out right from the start that this term social institution, it's not exactly crystal clear. In ordinary language and even in philosophical discussions, there's some ambiguity.
There is, but it also suggests, and I think this is a really good starting point, that grounding our philosophical exploration in the work that sociologists have done, specifically contemporary sociology, can be immensely helpful. Sociologists have actually come up with some more consistent definitions of what we mean by social institutions.
Okay, so let's tap into that sociological wisdom then. Where do they start?
Well, one prominent sociologist, Jonathan Turner, defines social institutions as complexes of positions, roles, norms, and values.
Okay, so we're already seeing some of those familiar sociological terms.
Right. But Turner goes further. He says these complexes are lodged in particular types of social structures and organizing relatively stable patterns of human activity.
Right.
And he emphasizes that these activities are generally related to, essential things, the life-sustaining stuff, like how resources are distributed, how societies reproduce themselves, and those fundamental societal structures that hold everything together.
So it sounds like we're talking about those fairly persistent features of social life, the things that provide a framework for how we interact and organize ourselves.
Yes, exactly. And another influential sociologist, Anthony Giddens, he actually uses that exact phrase. He describes institutions as the more enduring features of social life. And he gives us some concrete examples like modes of discourse, political institutions, economic structures, and legal systems. These all fall under what Giddens calls institutional orders, the more stable and patterned aspects of society.
Okay, so we're getting a clearer picture here. And then there's Ram Hare. He talks about an interlocking double structure of persons as role holders in social practices.
Yes. Hare's view really highlights how individuals and their roles are intertwined with these larger social practices and structures. It's not just about abstract rules. It's about people enacting those rules within a specific social context.
And he gives us this wide range of examples. We're talking everything from, very official things like governments and legal systems to more everyday things like universities, hospitals, corporations, schools, shops, and even the post office.
Even the British monarchy.
Yeah.
You can see, from a sociological perspective, we're dealing with a really broad spectrum of phenomena here. But I think these sociological definitions give us a good solid foundation for them moving into the more philosophical questions.
Right, because it helps us understand what philosophers are actually trying to grapple with.
Exactly. When philosophers talk about institutions, they have these concrete examples in mind: governments, families, legal systems, universities, hospitals, corporations, schools, shops, post offices. They're trying to figure out what makes these things tick, what their essential nature is, and how they fit into our broader understanding of social reality.
Okay, so that brings us to a pretty fundamental question. Why are philosophers even interested in this? Like you said, sociologists have already done a lot of work on this. What is it about social institutions that attracts philosophical attention?
That's a really good question. And the entry actually acknowledges this. It points out that, historically speaking, social institutions might have seemed like a topic that primarily belonged to sociologists. And that makes sense. They're the ones out there doing the empirical research, observing how these institutions actually function in the real world.
But it sounds like something has changed.
It has. In recent years, there's been a surge in philosophical engagement with social institutions. And the entry suggests that there are a couple of key reasons for this. First, it's connected to broader developments in philosophy itself, particularly in the philosophy of action, where philosophers have been trying to understand the nature of social action, collective intentionality, and the very fabric of social reality.
Okay, so those are some pretty deep philosophical waters, but I think what her listeners are really interested in is why should they, as philosophers, care about this?
Right, and this brings us to the second reason the entry highlights, and it's particularly relevant for someone like you who's interested in ethics and political philosophy. The entry points out that normative fields like these, when we talk about a just society, the ideal political order, the principles that should guide our collective life, these all inherently rely on some underlying understanding of what social institutions are.
Oh, okay, I see what you mean. You can't really talk about how society should be organized without first having some grasp of how it is organized, right?
Right. Precisely. It's like trying to design a building without knowing what the load-bearing walls are. Social institutions are those foundational structures that shape the very possibilities of social life. They provide the framework within which we act, interact, and pursue our individual and collective goals. And if we want to talk about justice, fairness, or the good life, we need to understand how these institutions function and how they influence our lives.
It's like you can't have a conversation about a just legal system if you don't even know what a legal system is, what it's made of, how it operates, and what its limitations are.
Exactly. And this point is actually illustrated really well by one of the most influential political philosophers of the 20th century, John Rawls. Rawls developed these incredibly elaborate theories about the principles of justice that should govern social institutions. He spent a lot of time thinking about how we should distribute resources fairly, how we should structure political institutions, and how we should think about the rights and duties of individuals within a just society.
But it sounds like you might have skipped a step.
Well, that's what the entry subtly suggests. It points out that Rawls, and to be fair, a lot of other political philosophers, they often proceed without a fully articulated theory of what these institutions are. They jump right into discussing how they should be organized without really examining the underlying philosophical questions about their nature and their essential characteristics. And I think this is a really important point for someone with philosophical interests like yours.
It makes sense. How can you effectively evaluate the justice of something if you don't have a clear philosophical understanding of what it is you're evaluating?
Right, and that's a key motivation for philosophical inquiry into social institutions. It's about getting a handle on these fundamental building blocks of our social world so that we can then have more informed and more meaningful discussions about how they should be structured and how they should function.
Okay, so we're starting to see the philosophical depth here. Now, the entry also raises another point that I think is really relevant from the philosophical perspective. It asks whether justice is actually a defining characteristic of all social institutions.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it might seem intuitive to think that all institutions, by their very nature, should aim for some kind of justice.
Right, like we want our legal system to be just, we want our economic system to be fair, we want our political institutions to be equitable.
Exactly. But the entry challenges this assumption a bit. It argues that while distributive justice, the fair allocation of resources and burdens is definitely relevant to a lot of institutions, it might not be the defining feature of every single one.
Okay, so give me an example. What kind of institution might not be primarily defined by justice?
Well, the entry mentions the Fourth Estate, the free press. Arguably, its primary purpose isn't necessarily to be just in the sense of distributing resources fairly. Its core function is to provide information, to hold those in power accountable, and to facilitate a well-informed public. It's primarily defined by values like truth, transparency, and the free flow of ideas.
Okay, I see what you mean. So while fairness and justice are certainly relevant in how the press operates, it's not its core defining value.
Exactly. And another example might be universities. They're institutions dedicated to the pursuit and dissemination of knowledge. Again, while justice and fairness are certainly important in how universities are run and how they treat their members, their primary goal is to advance knowledge and to cultivate intellectual inquiry.
Right, so their core function is about truth, understanding, and education, not necessarily about achieving perfect distributive justice.
Precisely. And I think this distinction is really important for a nuanced philosophical understanding of social institutions. It suggests that different types of institutions might have different primary normative foundations. Their core values might be rooted in different moral principles, and this in turn shapes how we evaluate them and how we think about what it means for them to function well.
So we're already starting to see that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to understanding these complex social structures.
Exactly. And this complexity is further highlighted by the 5 main theoretical sections that the entry lays out, a roadmap, if you will, for how philosophers have tried to make sense of all of this.
Okay, give us the preview. What are these 5 major approaches?
All right. First, we have an overview of, well, of all the key accounts, both from the sociological side and the philosophical side. And this section really gets to the heart of those fundamental disagreements about what these social institutions are at their most basic level. It's delving into those ontological questions.
Okay, and then?
Then we move into individualist theories. These tend to draw on rational choice theory and the idea of coordination equilibria, how individuals acting in their own self-interest can end up creating stable patterns of social interaction.
Interesting. And what comes after that?
Next, we'll explore collective acceptance theories. These place a lot of emphasis on shared beliefs and intentions. They argue that institutions exist and have their power because we, collectively, believe in them and accept them as real and as having certain properties.
Okay, so that's a very different approach.
It is. And then we'll look at the teleological account. This perspective shifts the focus to the ends or purposes that institutions serve. It suggests that institutions exist because they help us achieve certain collective goals or meet certain basic human needs.
And finally?
Finally, we get to what might be the most philosophically perplexing issue of all, the question of agency. Can we meaningfully say that institutions themselves are agents capable of acting and making decisions? Or is all agency ultimately reducible to the actions and intentions of the individuals within those institutions?
Okay, wow, that's a pretty comprehensive roadmap. But before we get into all of that, the entry makes some important conceptual distinctions that I think are crucial for our deep dive, especially for our listeners who are approaching this from a philosophical perspective. It's about clarifying exactly what we're talking about when we use the term social institution.
Yes, absolutely, because the entry highlights that we need to be careful not to confuse social institutions with other less complex social forms. These simpler forms, things like conventions, rules, norms, roles, and rituals, they're often seen as the building blocks, the elements that make up institutions, but they're not the same thing as the institutions themselves.
Okay, so give me an example. What's the difference between, say, a rule and an institution?
Well, think about a single traffic law. Drive on the right side of the road.
Yeah.
That's a rule, right? It tells us how we're supposed to behave in a particular situation.
Right.
But that rule is just one small part of a much larger and more complex system. The institution of a transportation system. That encompasses all sorts of things. We're talking traffic laws, road infrastructure, vehicle regulations, licensing procedures, traffic enforcement, and so on. The individual rule, drive on the right, is just one piece of that much larger institutional puzzle.
Ah, okay, I see. So a convention like tipping in a restaurant or a rule about wearing a uniform at work, these are components that might be part of an institution but aren't institutions themselves.
Exactly. And it's important to make that distinction because when we're talking about social institutions, we're talking about these more encompassing, more structured, and more enduring features of social life.
And the entry also makes the point that we need to distinguish institutions from even larger, more, well, holistic entities like societies or cultures.
Right, because institutions, they kind of act as the building blocks within these larger entities. A society typically encompasses all sorts of institutions. We're talking government, legal systems, economic structures, family structures, educational systems, and so on.
But a society is also, it's also more than just the sum of its institutions, right?
Exactly. A society has a certain level of, of self-sufficiency that individual institutions don't. Typically, a society handles things like reproduction, language transmission, education, economic activity, and, to some degree, even political independence within its own bounds. Whereas a single institution, it relies on that broader societal context to exist and to function.
It's embedded within that larger social fabric. Okay, and then there's the issue of the relationship between institutions and organizations. And that line can seem a little blurry sometimes.
It can, definitely. There's a significant overlap between the two. And the entry points out that a lot of institutions operate through specific organizations. Think about capitalism, for example. Capitalism as an economic system, as an institution, it functions through all sorts of organizations, corporations, banks, stock exchanges, regulatory bodies, and so on.
Right, so the institution provides the framework, the rules of the game, so to speak.
Exactly. And then you have these organizations that actually operate within that framework, carrying out specific functions and contributing to the overall functioning of the institution.
And then there's the idea of meta-institutions, which I think is it's kind of fascinating.
Yeah. The entry gives the example of a government. A government is kind of a super institution in the sense that it has the role of organizing and regulating all these other institutions within its jurisdiction. It sets the legal framework, it enforces laws, it provides public services, it oversees the economy to some extent. It's kind of like the conductor of the orchestra.
Trying to make sure everything's working in harmony. Okay, and then there's this idea that some institutions are just more fundamental than others.
Right, and the entry specifically points to language and the family as potential candidates for these foundational institutions.
Because language, I mean, it underpins so much of what we do as social beings, right? It's how we communicate, how we share ideas, how we coordinate our actions.
Precisely. And thinkers like Searle argue that language is particularly fundamental because it provides the very tools we use to establish and maintain all these other institutions through speech acts. We use language to create laws, to establish contracts, to make promises, to declare things official.
And then the family, well, that's kind of, it's the bedrock of society in many ways. It's where new members are brought into the world, where primary socialization happens.
It's where we learn those basic values, norms, and behaviors that prepare us for life in the larger society. So it's not hard to see why the family might be considered a fundamental institution. It plays a vital role in social continuity, in transmitting culture from one generation to the next.
And before we move on to those theoretical accounts that the entry lays out, there's one more point of, well, potential confusion that the entry highlights. It's about the word institution itself. Like, how do we even use that word? What does it actually refer to?
It's a good point. Because, we use the word institution in a few different ways. It can refer to a specific entity, like, say, Harvard University.
Right.
Or it can refer to a type of thing, like universities in general. And sometimes it's even used to refer to a set of related entities, like the institutions of higher education in the U.S., which would include all the various colleges and universities.
So there's a certain amount of flexibility in how we use the term.
There is. And the entry suggests that focusing on the word organization can sometimes be helpful in clarifying things, because organization usually refers to a specific instance, a bounded entity. But even though it might sometimes be clearer, institution carries this extra weight, this connotation of central importance and long-term endurance. It's like an organization can be temporary, but an institution is something that's deeply ingrained in the social fabric.
Okay, so with all those important distinctions in mind, those conceptual building blocks, let's move on to the general properties of social institutions. What are those common features that most, if not all, social institutions seem to share?
Well, the entry identifies 4 key aspects: structure, function, culture, and sanctions. These 4 elements provide a good starting point for analyzing and comparing different institutions.
Okay, let's start with structure. What do we mean by the structure of a social institution?
Well, when we talk about structure, we're essentially talking about the framework of an institution, the way it's organized. And, from a philosophical perspective, this involves understanding the different roles within an institution, how those roles are defined, and how they relate to each other. And these roles are typically occupied by individuals, but often they also involve material components. Like, think about the physical buildings, the technology, the equipment, the resources that are associated with an institution.
Right.
And these roles come with specific tasks and rules that govern how those tasks should be carried out. What are the duties, the responsibilities, the procedures associated with a particular role? And importantly, these roles are typically interdependent. They're connected to each other in a complex web of relationships, and they're often arranged hierarchically, with some roles having more authority or power than others. And ideally, all of this structure, these roles, these tasks, these rules, they all contribute in some way to the overall goals or functions of the institution.
So it's like we have the individuals, they're playing their specific roles, they're following the rules, they're using the resources, and all of that is supposed to work together to achieve some larger purpose.
Exactly. Now, the entry does point out that this idea of a fixed structure, a clearly defined set of rules, it has faced some challenges, particularly when we consider how we talk about institutions. We often attribute actions to institutions as a whole, like we might say the government decided to raise taxes.
Right.
But for a philosopher, this raises the question of, well, who is actually doing the deciding? Is the government itself an agent? Or is this just shorthand for saying that certain individuals within the government made that decision?
Right. It's about how we should understand institutional action.
Exactly. And the entry discusses how some philosophers have tried to reconcile this idea of a fixed structure with the fact that institutional actions often involve a complex interplay of individual decisions and actions.
Hmm.
One philosopher, Ludwig, he proposes a time-indexed, reductive individualist view. He suggests that when we say the Supreme Court, for example, we're not actually referring to some separate entity, some super agent.
Okay, so it's not like the Supreme Court is like this independent being that exists apart from the individual justices.
Right. Ludwig argues that the Supreme Court acts as a definite description, not a proper name. So what the Supreme Court does at any given time is simply what the specific individuals who are justices at that time do. The actual people might change, but the description still holds. This is a way of trying to ground our talk of institutional action in the actions of individuals, which is something a lot of philosophers are drawn to.
Okay, that makes sense. And structure isn't just about these formal roles and rules, is it? There's also the more informal dimension of institutional culture.
Absolutely. Culture is a huge part of what makes an institution what it is. It encompasses those informal attitudes, the values, the norms, the overall ethos, or the spirit that characterizes the institution. It's the unwritten rules, the shared assumptions, the ways of doing things that aren't necessarily codified, but that everyone kind of knows and follows. And this informal culture, it can have a huge impact on how things are actually done within an institution, often shaping behavior even more powerfully than the explicit rules.
It's like you can have the most meticulously crafted rules and regulations, but if the culture of an institution is toxic, if there's a lack of trust or respect, or if there are unspoken norms that contradict the formal rules, then the institution isn't going to function very well.
Exactly. And that's why understanding institutional culture is so important, both for sociologists and for philosophers.
Okay, so we've got structure, we've got culture. What about function?
Function is all about, well, it's about the purpose of an institution. What does it do? What role does it play in the larger social system? And the entry makes a subtle but important philosophical distinction between end and function. End is more about the intended goal, what the people within the institution are trying to achieve.
Right.
But function can sometimes be understood in a more causal or even teleological sense. It's about what the institution actually does in the world, regardless of the intentions of the individuals within it.
So an institution might have an intended function that aligns perfectly with its actual effects.
Exactly. But it's also possible that an institution might have unintended consequences, or that its actual function might diverge from its stated purpose over time.
Which can be a rich area of inquiry for social scientists and philosophers.
Absolutely. Because it forces us to think critically about the relationship between intention and outcome, about the role of unintended consequences in shaping social reality, and about how institutions evolve and adapt over time.
Okay, and finally, there's the issue of sanctions.
Right. Sanctions are essentially the mechanisms that institutions use to enforce their rules and norms. And the entry points out that there's a general agreement that informal sanctions, things like social disapproval, gossip, ostracism, those are pretty much a universal feature of social institutions.
Right, because even in the most informal social settings, if you violate the norms, you're likely to face some kind of some kind of social consequences.
Exactly. People might look at you funny. They might stop inviting you to things. You might become the subject of gossip. These informal sanctions, they can be really powerful in shaping our behavior.
But the entry also mentions that there's a debate about whether formal sanctions, things like legal punishments or fines or expulsion from an institution, whether those are a necessary component of what makes something a social institution.
Yes. And it's an interesting debate. Because on the one hand, you could argue that formal sanctions are essential for maintaining order and stability within an institution, especially within those institutions that are embedded in a legal framework.
Right, like if you break the law, you're likely to face some kind of legal consequences, and if you violate the rules of a university, you could be expelled.
Exactly. But on the other hand, the entry points to examples like long-standing informal economic exchange systems. These systems have existed and functioned effectively for centuries without necessarily relying on formal legally enforced rules.
So that suggests that maybe formal sanctions aren't a universal requirement for something to count as a social institution.
That's the argument. And it raises some really interesting philosophical questions about the nature of social order. the role of coercion in maintaining that order, and the different ways in which institutions can achieve stability and enforce their norms.
Okay, so we've laid a pretty solid foundation here. We've looked at the sociological definitions, we've explored why philosophers care about this, and we've examined those key properties that most social institutions seem to share.
We have. And now the real fun begins. We get to dive into those specific philosophical accounts, those different theoretical frameworks that philosophers have developed to try to make sense of these complex social phenomena.
Excellent. And I think a good place to start is with those atomistic theories. Those are the ones that tend to equate institutions with simpler social forms like conventions or rules.
Right. And atomistic theories are appealing to some philosophers because they try to explain complex social phenomena in terms of simpler, more basic elements. They're trying to, in a sense, reduce institutions down to their constituent parts. And this raises some immediate questions for a philosopher, particularly questions about reductionism. Can we really understand something as complex as a government or a legal system by simply analyzing the individual conventions and rules that make it up? Or is there something more, something emergent, that arises when these simpler elements are combined in a particular way?
So it's about the relationship between the parts and the whole.
Exactly. And one of the classic examples of an atomistic theory is David Lewis's account of conventions. Lewis, a very influential philosopher, argues that conventions are essentially solutions to coordination problems. And he uses the example of driving. Everyone benefits from driving on the same side of the road. If we all drove wherever we wanted, there would be chaos.
Right, constant accidents.
Exactly. So we have this convention of driving on the right side of the road in some countries, on the left in others. And this convention, it solves a clear coordination problem. It allows us to predict how others are going to behave, it reduces the risk of accidents, and it makes driving a lot smoother and more efficient.
So we have this regularity in behavior that arises from our mutual expectations and from our desire to avoid those negative consequences.
Precisely. And Lewis argues that many, if not most, social institutions can be understood as arising from these kinds of conventions. We develop these regularities in behavior, these shared expectations, because they help us solve coordination problems and achieve certain goals.
Okay, that's an interesting idea. But as the entry points out, institutions like governments or universities, they seem to be more than just a random assortment of conventions. They have this defined structure, a sense of unity, and often a complex set of interconnected rules and rules that go beyond just solving simple coordination problems.
Right. And that's one of the main challenges for atomistic accounts. How do you explain the inherent structure and unity of these complex entities while staying true to your fundamental claim that they're ultimately reducible to simpler components?
Right, because a mere collection of conventions like driving on the left, using cutlery in a certain way, and greeting each other with a handshake that doesn't really add up to a university.
It doesn't. So atomistic theories need to do more than just list a bunch of conventions. They need to explain how these conventions are interconnected, how they form a coherent whole, and how they give rise to those more complex features that we associate with institutions. They might propose, for example, that institutions are bundles of related conventions or rules, but even then, they still need to account for the integrated and often hierarchical nature of these bundles.
Okay, so there's work to be done there.
There is, but that doesn't mean that atomistic theories are completely off track. Another philosopher, Guala, he tries to bridge this gap between simple conventions and complex institutions with what he calls the rules and equilibrium approach.
Rules and equilibrium. Okay, tell me more about that.
So Guala's basic idea is that institutions are essentially sets of rules. But these aren't just any rules. They're rules that individuals have a strong incentive to follow because of the way the system is set up, the way the incentives and expectations are structured.
So it's about self-interest, but it's self-interest within a framework of rules.
Precisely. And Guala argues that when individuals are motivated to follow these rules, it leads to predictable patterns of behavior, coordination, and cooperation. And the stability of the institution arises from this equilibrium of individual motivations and expectations.
So it's like everyone is acting rationally in their own self-interest, but that rationality is shaped by the rules of the institution, and that creates a kind of order and stability.
Exactly. And what's interesting from a philosophical standpoint is that Guala, unlike some other theorists, he doesn't think we need to invoke things like shared intentions or collective beliefs to explain the existence and persistence of institutions. For him, it all boils down to the rational self-interest of individuals operating within a given framework of rules.
Okay, so that's a pretty individualistic approach.
It is. and it contrasts with those collective acceptance theories that we'll talk about later. But even within this individualistic framework, Gala makes an important distinction about the nature of institutional rules themselves. He argues that most rules are regulative rather than constitutive.
Okay, now hold on. What's the difference between a regulative rule and a constitutive rule?
Well, a regulative rule is a rule that governs actions that could exist independently of the rule. Think about the rule, don't steal. Stealing is an action that could exist even if there were no rule against it. The rule simply regulates that pre-existing action.
Right, it tells you not to do it, but the action itself doesn't depend on the rule for its existence.
Exactly. Now, a constitutive rule, on the other hand, is a rule that, in a sense, creates new forms of activity. Searle famously uses the example of the rules of chess. The rules of chess don't just regulate some pre-existing activity, they actually define what it means to play chess. The very activity of playing chess only exists because of those rules. They constitute the game.
Ah, okay, that's a really clear distinction.
It is. And Gawala, he tends to downplay the significance of these constitutive rules. He often argues that what appear to be constitutive rules are really just shorthand for patterns of behavior that are actually governed by underlying regulative rules. So, for example, he might say that the rules of chess aren't actually constitutive. They're just a convenient way of describing a complex set of regulative rules that govern how we move the pieces and how we win the game.
So he's basically saying that we can explain everything in terms of regulative rules.
That's his tendency. And this, of course, has some pretty big ontological implications. Because if he's right, then it suggests that social institutions at their core are just patterns of behavior governed by these regulative rules.
Yeah.
They're not fundamentally different from natural phenomena, which are also governed by, laws of nature.
Okay, and this brings us to Gawala's views on the mind dependence of social entities, which is a really tricky philosophical issue.
It is. And Gawala he's quite subtle in how he approaches this. He distinguishes between two types of dependence: causal dependence and ontological dependence.
Okay, break that down for us.
So causal dependence means that something exists or functions because of our beliefs about it.
Mm-hmm.
Think about paper money. Paper money only has value because we believe it does. If everyone suddenly stopped believing that these pieces of paper could be exchanged for goods and services, they would become worthless.
Right. It's our collective belief that gives them their value.
Exactly. Now, ontological dependence is a much stronger form of dependence. It means that something's very nature is determined by something else. Like, water is ontologically dependent on the chemical structure of H2O. Water just is H2O.
Okay, so there's a real difference there.
There is, and Gawala argues that social entities like institutions, they are causally dependent on our beliefs, but they're not ontologically dependent. So institutions exist and function because we believe in them and act accordingly, but their existence doesn't ultimately depend on some kind of collective mind or some separate realm of social facts.
So it's a kind of middle ground between saying that institutions are just figments of our imagination and saying that they're these completely objective entities that exist independently of us.
Exactly. And Gawala uses this distinction to critique the idea that the mind dependence of institutions leads to infallibilism. Infallibilism is the view that we can't be wrong about the nature of our own institutions.
Right, because if institutions are just a product of our beliefs, then how could we possibly be mistaken about them?
That's the worry. But Gawala argues that the very fact that we can have mistaken beliefs about our institutions shows that they don't ontologically depend on our collective acceptance in that strong, infallible sense. We can have false beliefs about how our legal system works, or we can misinterpret the rules of a game, and that doesn't mean that the legal system or the game cease to exist.
Okay, so he's trying to strike a balance here between acknowledging the role of our beliefs in shaping social reality and avoiding this kind of extreme subjectivism where anything goes.
Exactly. He wants to maintain a degree of realism about institutions while also acknowledging the crucial role that our beliefs.